start by saying a few words about my exposure to the music of Robert Fripp. I've been a fan of King Crimson for a long time. I've heard all 13 of their studio albums, though some more than others. Still not very well versed with The Construction of Light. I've heard a fistful of their live albums. I've seen them live in the 3-drummer configuration. Even had one of their box set CD things that they offer as a perk to people who purchase the VIP packages. So, not a King Crimson completist, but certainly a big fan.
They never sold out or had a commercial phase. As a matter of fact, Fripp had a way of pulling up stakes and closing shop for years on end when he felt like the muse had left King Crimson. First time that happened was in 1974, and he had a gap of about 7 years before Crimson reared its head again.
Outside of King Crimson, though, my knowledge of Fripp is minimal. I know that Robert Fripp appears on a few albums by other artists I've heard, like Fear of Music by Talking Heads,
Fade Away and Radiate from Blondie,
Pawn Hearts by Van de Graaff Generator,
Way Out of Here from Porcupine Tree,
the Melts album by Peter Gabriel,
Sleepwalk from Joe Satriani,
and at one point I think I even owned a copy of I Advance Masked by Andy Summers and Robert Fripp. And since starting the series, we can add Little Red Record by Matching Mole and Heroes by Bowie. Plus, I had a friend in Tallahassee, and in 1989 he joined the League of Crafty Guitarists.
Fripp has a one-of-a-kind guitar style. I've mentioned before he's a bit of a mad scientist of guitar because he avoids all the cliches that a rock guitarist has. He doesn't just work with typical blues scales like a lot of rock guitarists do. Instead, he prefers symmetrical scales in many cases. Say the whole tone, which is a series of whole steps. If you ever watched a TV show and someone drifts off to sleep and you hear this dreamy music in the background, that's often the whole tone scale. It has this sort of floaty, dreamy quality to it. When played on, like, say, a vibraphone, you play it on a distorted guitar and suddenly it becomes incredibly menacing. And it's the heart of a number of Crimson pieces. Check out a tune called Fracture from the Starless and Bible Black album. That's a great example.
Oh, and we can't forget the crowning achievement of Robert Fripp's career. The one Fripp composition heard by hundreds of millions worldwide. The one thing that will immortalize him as an artist for the ages. The Windows Vista startup sound. Kinda gets you right here, doesn't it?
So today's album is actually the second that's listed as his solo works. He had one that he did originally with Brian Eno that's considered by many to be his first. And this is the second. This album's almost like a musical sampler plate in a way. It doesn't really hang together the way a typical Crimson album would, where it has a flow that kind of logically goes from one thing to the next. This is kind of an interesting hodgepodge of different things that he seemed to be enamored with at the time.
Wow, I honestly had no idea that Robert Fripp had this side to him. It's like Red had a kid with Simply Red, and that kid goes to rock and roll high school in the gifted program. Or maybe like a prog bomb went off at CBGB's. I certainly didn't expect that the main songwriter and performer of King Crimson would produce an album that's 45 minutes long with 17 tracks, most under 3 minutes, and none longer than 4 minutes 30. Listening to Exposure for the first time, I see some discongruousness from one track to the next a couple of times. There's a couple of times on this album where I'm so shocked by what I'm hearing when transitioning from one song to the next that I completely miss the first few seconds of the song. In the start of the album, I'm reminded of the Mothers of Invention were only in it for the money because of the talk of commercial appeal and a ringing telephone and that whole kind of collage business right at the start. But then we get into the music proper, right? And revisiting a theme from a couple weeks ago, when You Burn Me Up, I'm a Cigarette started, I again asked Emily, if you had to guess who this is, how many guesses would it take you to get to Robert Fripp? The last thing in the world I expected on a Fripp album was a 145 Romantics style guitar and piano based new wave tune, even with the weird little spoken recording in place of a solo. In Breathless, we get those same 3/1 and sharp 4/1 style chords that he uses in Red. And Breathless. Plus, a great bass part from Tony Levin, and drums by Narada Michael Walden. And it's in 7. Mostly, the bridge has alternating bars of 11/8 and 3/4, maybe some others. It's hard to count. Disengage. The opening arpeggios sound to me a lot like the Mahavishnu Orchestra, but any thoughts of fusion go out the window when the vocals starts and it suddenly has Andy Summers' vibe from Mother on Synchronicity. Telephone is ringing. Is that my mother on the... Then the song climaxes and there's a solo and we get about 6 bars of that and then the song just fades out. That's it. And shortly thereafter, Daryl Hall takes over.
Robert and Daryl Hall really hit it off well. Robert said that Daryl was one of the greatest improvisers he ever worked with.
For the slow and soulful North Star. And in that song, you can hear some of the quieter side of the Crimson that would later come out in songs like Mate Kudasai.
As a matter of fact, Crimson has some of the most beautiful ballads in all of progressive rock. For example, Epitaph from the first album. But I Cadence and Cascade. Sliding, mystified on the wine. Mate Kudasai. She waits in the air. Mate Kudasai.
But with Daryl Hall's cadenza heavy singing over it, it becomes very much radio soul. Chicago. Slow 6/8 blues kind of a thing. But with Peter Hamill's voice over the top of it all, it does feel a bit like Van de Graaff Generator. NY3. There's a lot going on in this tune. This might be my favorite song on the album, just for Fripp's impossible guitar playing on it. And the shouted argument going on in the background, right? Tension on tension on tension. Interpersonal on harmonic on rhythmic. And the next song, Mary, just beautiful. When the first words you hear after NY3 are that a creature could be so lonely, that got my attention. Plus an actual 2-5-1 on a relative minor, a la You've Got a Friend. Not something I thought I'd ever hear from Robert Fripp. Though in fairness, he doesn't resolve it in the normal way. Exposure. Wow, does Terry Roche's voice go through the ringer on this one. Hope they had some throat coat ready for her between takes.
Like the title track Exposure is on Robert's album, but it's also on Peter Gabriel's, with Peter singing Exposure.
Makes me raspy just thinking of it. But as the man says, it's impossible to achieve the aim without suffering. More Mahavishnu-style arpeggios in Haden 2, and in this case the comparison is more apt, as the song plays out a lot like Hope from Birds of Fire. I may not have had enough of me, but I've had enough of you. Yeah, well, same to you, buddy. There's more impossible guitar frippery on this one, but mostly it's a vocal duet between Peter Hamill and Terry Rocha, right? But I think there's more going on here than just the song. Water Music 1 into Here Comes the Flood into Water Music 2. When compared to the arrangement of the same song on Peter Gabriel's first solo album, this version is quieter, just piano, voice, and some guitar Frippertronics type ambience. It's a lovely one. Or 3. Made Emily cry when I played it in the kitchen while making dinner. After listening the first time, I come away thinking that there's a lot to unpack. I feel like I've just heard something impactful and brilliant, but also incongruent. Not necessarily musically incongruent, but perhaps there is a historical/cultural incongruity that has me itching my subconscious. I don't know. I think I'm going to have to dig particularly deep this week.
And I think for a lot of people, this album is kind of a bridge between 70s Crimson and 80s Crimson. Although there's a stopgap between the two, a group that Robert put together called the League of Gentlemen. Which definitely connects this album to Discipline from King Crimson in 1981. A lot of the arpeggiated ideas that are so prevalent on 80s Crimson albums can be heard on the League of Gentlemen album as well.
If I had to summarize Robert Fripp's exposure in one word, challenging. Songs like Breathless, NY3, and Hodden 2 are technically difficult to execute and would, I think, be difficult to artistically resonate with unless you already had some exposure to the tropes of progressive music. But for me, the challenging aspect of this music goes deeper than just that. I have a lot of anxiety when it comes to the New York music scene of the mid to late 70s, the post-punk and early new wave, and for that matter, punk in general. Historically, I know that this music is important. I know that a lot of people feel an emotional connection to that music, and many people were moved to make music themselves as a result. And I think that's fabulous. That alone is enough for me to be glad that it exists. On the other hand, I've always had a philosophical issue with any artistic movement whose primary means of expression is "this is what I'm not" instead of "this is what I am." Because punk's main thrust was, we're not like the music we've heard, right? We're not like today's pop music. Well, today's pop music is a relative term. I mean, go back and look at the Billboard Hot 100 for 75, 76, 77, 78. Sure, there's ELO and Wings and a lot of things you've heard, but there's also Walter Murphy and the Big Apple Band, Rhythm Heritage, C.W. McCall, Dr. Buzzard's Original Savannah Band. You remember any of them? My point is, what happens to punk, whose main artistic function is to be their antithesis artistically, when the originals are forgotten? So when I hear groups like the Ramones or Iggy Pop or the New York Dolls, that's what I'm hearing. I hear a group of people proclaiming, we're not Dan Hill, we're not Exile. And yet, more folks know the Ramones today than Dan Hill. So there's that. To back up just a minute, I find myself drawn to fusion and prog because no matter how far up their own backsides they can be sometimes, at the core of it, at least they're trying to bring something original into the artistic world. Not just mimicking radio hits, and not just shouting loudly that radio hits suck. But what was once a clear and bright line between the art for art's sake crowd and music as a lifestyle signifier crowd, that line for me is starting to blur. I know there's a tenuous connection between the CBGB's scene and the prog crowd thanks to Talking Heads, right? Who always seemed more to me like an experiment in the deconstruction of James Brown, but with angsty lyrics, than anything approaching punk or new wave. But in the last couple of weeks, I've started to see progressive tendrils into areas I wouldn't have expected. Not just with David Bowie's Berlin Trilogy, but also with the Iggy Pop album, The Idiot, that came out at the same time, with the same personnel and the same artistic impetus. And it's been my experience that there's a whole lot of Iggy Pop fans out there that would rather line their shorts with Poison Sumac than listen to Thick as a Brick all the way through. And Robert Fripp's exposure might be the biggest challenge to my artistic worldview, musically speaking, of everything so far. Not only was Fripp involved in adding guitar to some of the recordings that made up the early new wave scene, but as evidenced on this album, he took part himself. On Exposure, there's the rawest, loudest, most urgent, no-wave rock experimentation you're likely to find anywhere. But there's also 3-chord bar band punk, blue-eyed soul, earnest folk rock, and of course the highly regimented and technically demanding progressive music that Fripp's been known for. And the fact that on Exposure, these worlds are overlapping in a way that feels genuine is very much a cognitive dissonance. So it looks like I've got a lot of work to do.
This album is part of a trilogy. Although on the surface you might never connect the dots, but there are 3 albums, including this one, that Robert was part of around this time period. This one, Exposure, Peter Gabriel's second solo album, which is commonly called Scratch, and an album from Daryl Hall called Sacred Songs, which was so radical that his record label was hesitant to release it, and I think it didn't even come out until a couple of years after it had been made.